Mr. Bear's New Baby by Debi Gliori. It is way past bedtime in the forest. It is time for everyone to be asleep. A dark and quiet time for hush and lullabies. But lights are on at Mr. Bear's house, and listen. Drifting out over the trees is the most awful din. It's the sound of Mr. Bear's new baby waking up. "Oh dear," sighed Mrs. Bear. "Oh dear," groaned Mr. Bear. "Wah!" squeaked the new baby. "What that baby needs is to be tucked in by her daddy," said Mr. Bear. He climbed out of bed and went to tuck in the new baby. But the baby squeaked more loudly. Mr. Bear gazed lovingly at the baby. "What that baby needs is some milk from her mummy," said Mr. Bear. And Mrs. Bear climbed out of the bed and fed the new baby. But the new baby spluttered and choked and squeaked some more. Mr. Bear paced up and down, patting the new baby's back. But the new baby closed her eyes, threw back her head, and opened her mouth for a huge squeak. "Goodness," said Mr. Bear, "what an enormous mouth for one so small. What you need is a lullaby." Mr. and Mrs. Bear sang the new baby a lullaby, but that didn't work either. There was a knock at the door. In staggered Mr. Bun with a rocking cradle. "Try this," he said, yawning. "When our 6 babies were small, this used to put 'em straight to sleep." So Mr. Bear tucked his new baby in the cradle, and they all took turns rocking her. But the cradle was too wobbly, and the new baby still squeaked. There was another knock on the door. In came Mrs. Hoot-to-It with a huge nest. "I don't know if this will work for new baby bears," she said, "but when little Howl was a baby, I would put her in it, and she would fall asleep at once." So Mr. Bear lifted the new baby out of the rocking cradle and put her in the nest. But the nest was too prickly, and the new baby continued to squeak. "Heavens," said Mr. Bear, feeling pretty close to squeaking himself. "How can someone so small make so much noise?" One by one, all Mr. Bear's sleepless neighbours came calling with things to help the new baby sleep. Mr. Rivet Frog brought his children's favourite lily pad, but that was too wet. Mrs. Buzz brought her infant's hive, but that was too sticky. Even Mrs. Grizzlebear brought baby Grizzlebear's shawl, but that was too woolly. While Mrs. Grizzlebear poured tea and Mrs. Bear passed cake around, Mr. Bear paced up and down with the sobbing baby over his shoulder. "Little one," he said, "my legs are tired with all this walking." The baby kept on crying. Mr. Bear patted the baby gently on her back and whispered in her ear. "Baby Bear," he said, "my shoulder is soggy with all these tears." The baby cried all the more. "Good grief," said Mr. Bear, feeling tired, soggy, and very fed up. "What on earth can I do to stop you crying?" A little figure appeared at the door, trailing a blanket behind her. "Whatever are you doing up?" said Mrs. Bear. "I can't sleep," said Small Bear. "The baby woke me up." "You're too small to be up this late," groaned Mrs. Bear. Come on, back to bed." "She's even smaller than I am," said Small Bear, "and she's up." The new baby looked up with a woebegone little hiccup. "I'm much bigger than both of you," sighed Mr. Bear, "and all I want is not to be up." "We'd better be going home to bed," said Mr. Bun and Mrs. Hoot-to-It. "Good night all," croaked Mr. Rivet Frog. "Sleep well," added Mrs. Buzz. "I'll come back for the shawl in the morning," said Mrs. Grizzlebear. All Mr. Bear's neighbours tiptoed out, leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bear with their wakeful little bears. The new baby was still crying. "I know why the new baby is crying," said Small Bear, climbing onto Mr. Bear's lap. "She's crying because she wants someone to cuddle up to. Babies are like that," she said, burrowing deep into her father's arms. "You're absolutely right, Small," said Mr. Bear, yawning widely. "Let's see if a bed full of bears to cuddle into will help Baby Bear go to sleep just this once." Carrying their little bears, Mr. and Mrs. Bear climbed upstairs to bed. Mr. and Mrs. Bear's bed wasn't wobbly or prickly, nor was it wet, sticky or woolly. In fact, it was utter bliss. The new baby stopped crying immediately, gazed into Mr. Bear's eyes, patted his nose, and fell asleep. "My goodness," said Mr. Bear, stunned by the sudden silence. "Well done, Small," said Mrs. Bear, turning over and starting to snore almost at once. But Small Bear was fast asleep and dreaming of being big, and very soon all was quiet and still. The house was full of the sound of sleeping bears. All that is, except for Mr. Bear. He lay in the dark listening to Mrs. Bear snoring, and far off in the trees the sound of Mrs. Hoot-to-It singing lullabies. The baby stretched like a furry starfish and smiled in her sleep. "How can someone so small take up so much room?" thought Mr. Bear. The last thing he heard before he fell asleep was Mrs. Hoot-to-It. "Good night. Good night to you, to you."